A single decision in Beijing could crash American tech stocks tomorrow. Venezuela's billion-pound gold fortune sits locked in London vaults, while its rightful owner remains a mystery. And the United States just proposed a military budget so massive it could reshape the entire global order. Welcome to 2026, where microchips, frozen assets, and military spending have become the new battlegrounds of world power. The world of semiconductors has entered uncharted territory, and the headlines coming out of Washington and Beijing seem to contradict each other with every passing week. At the center of this technological storm sits one crucial question. Will the Chinese government permit American-made NVIDIA H200 chips to flood into their domestic market? Or will they slam the door shut on what could be the most consequential tech trade of the decade? This isn't just a business transaction. This is about the very architecture of America's economic future. The United States economy, as it stands today, has become almost dangerously reliant on its technology sector. The investment ecosystem surrounding artificial intelligence and semiconductor companies has created what many economists now describe as a self-sustaining loop, where continuous innovation fuels investor confidence, which in turn generates capital for more innovation. Break that cycle, and the consequences could ripple across the entire American financial system. Consider the numbers from 2025. The United States economy expanded by approximately 2% that year, a respectable figure by most standards. But here's what makes that growth remarkable. Technology spending alone accounted for nearly the entire 2%. That's an extraordinary concentration of economic activity in a single sector. When you compare this investment level to historical benchmarks, the scale becomes even clearer. America is currently pouring more resources into technology infrastructure than it spent on building out nationwide broadband during the internet boom of the early 2000s. We're talking about expenditures that dwarf some of the most ambitious projects in human history. The Manhattan Project, which developed the atomic bomb. The Apollo program, which put humans on the lunar surface. The Interstate Highway System, which connected an entire continent. Combine all of those legendary undertakings, and today's tech investment still comes out ahead. This reveals an uncomfortable truth about the modern American economy. It has placed an enormous bet on technology companies, with NVIDIA positioned squarely at the table's center. Jensen Huang, the company's CEO and co-founder, has become more than just a business leader. He's become a critical pillar supporting American economic growth. If NVIDIA's revenue streams dry up, if new chip generations stop rolling out on schedule, the entire vision of continent-spanning AI infrastructure could evaporate almost overnight. And that brings us back to China. Right now, two completely opposing narratives are circulating in financial and tech circles. According to one set of reports, Chinese regulatory authorities are preparing to greenlight NVIDIA chip imports during the current quarter. If accurate, this would mean H200 processors could begin arriving in Chinese data centers as early as March. But simultaneously, another stream of intelligence suggests the exact opposite, that Chinese technology firms have been instructed to halt all procurement activities until Beijing issues formal authorization. These companies are essentially in a holding pattern, unable to move forward with purchases that could amount to billions of dollars. Inside China's corridors of power, this tension reflects two fundamentally different priorities pulling in opposite directions. Private sector technology companies, giants like ByteDance that compete on the global stage, desperately want access to these advanced chips. For them, artificial intelligence development has become an arms race, and being cut off from the world's most powerful processors puts them at a severe competitive disadvantage. They see the H200 not as a political statement, but as a necessary tool for survival in a cutthroat industry. But the Chinese government views this situation through an entirely different lens. For Beijing, semiconductors aren't simply another commodity to be traded in global markets. They represent national security infrastructure, the technological foundation upon which future military, economic, and social systems will be built. Chinese leadership knows with absolute certainty that Washington's ultimate goal is to prevent China from achieving semiconductor self-sufficiency. The entire architecture of American export controls, sanctions, and diplomatic pressure has been designed to slow down Chinese progress in advanced chip manufacturing. This makes every approval decision fraught with strategic implications. Beijing is acutely aware that becoming dependent on American technology creates vulnerabilities that adversaries could exploit in future conflicts. The government remembers how quickly the United States cut off Huawei's access to critical components when political winds shifted. NVIDIA understands this precarious situation perfectly well, which is why the company has adopted an unusual requirement for Chinese customers: full payment upfront. This isn't standard practice in normal business relationships, but nothing about the current semiconductor landscape is normal. NVIDIA knows that Beijing's position could change overnight, that approved orders could be canceled without warning, and they're protecting themselves accordingly. China's long-term strategic vision has become increasingly transparent to outside observers. Beijing has no intention of allowing foreign semiconductor companies to dominate their domestic market indefinitely. The reason is straightforward. If Chinese companies can simply purchase the world's best chips from American suppliers, their motivation to develop homegrown alternatives evaporates. Why invest billions in risky research and development when you can just buy the finished product? Yet the Chinese government also recognizes that NVIDIA's H200 chips aren't just powerful, they're transformative. These processors can accelerate AI model training by orders of magnitude. They can revolutionize healthcare systems, making diagnostic tools more accurate and personalized medicine more accessible. They can optimize payment networks, reducing transaction times and costs. They can make factories smarter, more efficient, more responsive to changing demand. In other words, these chips can genuinely advance China's industrial development across multiple sectors. Looking ahead to 2026, the H200 will remain at the cutting edge of what's commercially available. But here's where Beijing's concerns deepen. It's not just about the hardware. When Chinese companies adopt NVIDIA chips, they inevitably become embedded in NVIDIA's software ecosystem. They build their AI models using NVIDIA's CUDA programming platform. They train their engineers on NVIDIA's tools. They optimize their code for NVIDIA's architecture. Over time, this creates a form of technological lock-in that goes far beyond any single chip purchase. NVIDIA doesn't just sell processors. It sells an entire integrated system. And once you're inside that system, switching to alternatives becomes exponentially more difficult and expensive. This is precisely why China has been frantically investing in domestic semiconductor champions. Huawei's Ascend 910C chip represents the most advanced Chinese-designed AI processor currently in production. Is it as powerful as NVIDIA's latest offerings? No, not yet. Independent benchmarks show it trailing behind American equivalents. But the gap is narrowing, and it's narrowing faster than many Western analysts predicted just a few years ago. By 2027, market research firms project that China's domestic AI chip market will reach a staggering $71 billion in value. And here's what should concern NVIDIA's shareholders. Just 3 Chinese companies, Huawei, Cambricon, and MetaX, are expected to control more than half of that enormous market. This isn't happening by accident. It's the direct result of Beijing's deliberate policy to achieve technological self-reliance, to create an indigenous semiconductor industry that can survive and thrive even if completely cut off from Western suppliers. But while China races to build its chip-making capacity, the United States faces a different kind of bottleneck, one that's received far less public attention but could prove equally critical. The problem isn't making advanced processors. The problem is powering them. Artificial intelligence data centers are extraordinarily power-hungry. The computational demands of training large language models, processing computer vision tasks, and running inference at scale require electrical infrastructure on a scale that most regions simply don't have. Current projections suggest that by the year 2030, data center power demand in the United States will triple. We're talking about an increase from roughly 50 gigawatts to nearly 150 gigawatts. To put that in perspective, that's enough electricity to power tens of millions of homes. Building out that kind of electrical capacity isn't just expensive. It requires massive investments in generation facilities, transmission lines, substations, and cooling systems. It requires skilled workers who can design, construct, and maintain this infrastructure. It requires navigating complex regulatory environments and community opposition. You could have the world's most advanced chips, but if you can't plug them in and keep them cool, they're essentially useless. This creates a fascinating paradox for American tech companies. If domestic demand for AI chips begins to slow, either because of power constraints, regulatory obstacles, or market saturation, then NVIDIA's growth story becomes increasingly dependent on international sales. And the largest potential international customer, by far, is China. If Beijing decides to block NVIDIA chips, or even just delays approval indefinitely, the impact on American technology companies could be severe. We're not just talking about NVIDIA's revenue, although that would certainly take a hit. We're talking about the broader ecosystem of companies that supply NVIDIA, that build data centers designed around NVIDIA chips, that create software optimized for NVIDIA architecture. The entire interconnected web of American tech innovation could face serious headwinds. And that brings us to the stock market. Right now, American equity valuations are at historically elevated levels, driven primarily by enthusiasm around technology stocks. NVIDIA itself has seen its market capitalization swing by hundreds of billions of dollars based on quarterly earnings reports and forward guidance. Investor sentiment in this sector is fragile, built on expectations of continued exponential growth. Any serious disruption to the China revenue story could trigger a broader reassessment of tech valuations, potentially leading to market volatility that extends well beyond the semiconductor industry. While this chip war plays out across the Pacific, another story unfolding in the Atlantic Ocean reveals just how interconnected and weaponized the global financial system has become. Venezuela's government assets, specifically those connected to the regime of Nicolas Maduro, have been systematically frozen across Western financial centers. This isn't just happening in predictable locations like Washington or London. Even traditionally neutral Switzerland, a country that built its banking reputation on discretion and non-interference, has joined the asset freeze. What makes this particularly noteworthy is the precedent it establishes. For decades, wealthy individuals and governments from countries with complicated relationships with the West, places like Russia, China, Iran, and others, have parked substantial portions of their wealth in Western financial institutions. They did this because these institutions were seen as stable, secure, and above politics. The Swiss bank account became a cultural touchstone precisely because Switzerland stayed neutral even during world wars. But the Venezuela situation demonstrates that this assumption of safety no longer holds. Western governments have shown they're willing to freeze, seize, or even liquidate assets when political considerations demand it. If assets are deemed to have been obtained through corruption or illegal means, they can be sold off with proceeds potentially redirected to other purposes. The message to wealthy individuals and foreign governments is becoming unmistakable. Money held in Western institutions is only as safe as your current political relationship with Western governments. That relationship can change quickly, and when it does, assets that you thought were secure can become inaccessible overnight. Venezuela's situation gets even stranger when you examine the details. The country's central bank still has over £1 billion worth of physical gold sitting in Bank of England vaults in London. This isn't digital currency that could theoretically be frozen with a keystroke. These are actual gold bars, weighing tons, sitting in secure facilities beneath the streets of London. And yet, Venezuela can't access them. The British government refused to recognize Maduro as Venezuela's legitimate leader, which created a legal labyrinth around ownership of state assets. Now that Maduro has been removed from power, new questions emerge. Who has the legal authority to claim that gold? Will it be Delcy Rodriguez or another figure from the new Venezuelan leadership? Will the United Kingdom require certain conditions to be met before releasing the gold? What role, if any, will the United States play in influencing this decision? These aren't simple questions with clear answers. The UK Foreign Secretary has publicly acknowledged the situation's complexity, suggesting that the gold could remain frozen until Venezuela establishes a government that meets certain democratic legitimacy standards as defined by British authorities. Adding another layer of complication, former President Trump has made remarks suggesting he might seek to influence Venezuelan political developments, though the specifics of what this means remain unclear. This 5-year saga over Venezuela's gold illustrates a fundamental problem with storing national wealth in foreign jurisdictions. Even physical assets, things you can theoretically touch and weigh, become subject to political decisions made by foreign governments. Ownership becomes conditional, dependent on maintaining the right political relationships and avoiding actions that powerful countries find objectionable. The broader implication is that we should expect more disputes like this in the future, not fewer. As geopolitical tensions increase, as countries take sides in conflicts, as sanctions become an increasingly common tool of statecraft, the number of frozen or contested assets will likely grow. This creates uncertainty for everyone involved in international finance, from sovereign wealth funds to multinational corporations to individual investors. At the same time, all of this is unfolding. Another trend is accelerating in an alarming direction: global militarization. Defense budgets around the world are expanding at rates not seen since the Cold War, and the United States is leading this charge with numbers that seemed unthinkable just a decade ago. The Trump administration has proposed a defense budget approaching $1.5 trillion. To understand how dramatic this is, consider that this represents nearly a 50% increase over the previous year's allocation. This isn't a modest adjustment or inflation index growth. This is a fundamental reshaping of federal spending priorities and a statement about America's willingness to project military power globally. Some of this spending relates to operations in the Western Hemisphere. Recent military activities connected to Venezuela have reportedly cost over $1 billion, but the ambitions extend far beyond South America. American political commentators have begun discussing Greenland in strategic terms, which has created nervous reactions in European capitals, particularly Copenhagen. Technically, under Cold War-era agreements that remain in effect, Denmark is obligated to defend Greenland's territorial integrity. But this creates an almost absurd scenario. Could Denmark, a small Nordic country with a population of less than 6 million people, actually resist American military action if Washington decided Greenland represented a strategic priority? The honest answer, uncomfortable as it may be, is almost certainly no. The sheer scale of American military resources makes such a confrontation fundamentally asymmetric. The Department of Defense, which some critics now refer to as the Department of War, controlled approximately $2.2 trillion in total resources last year and planned expenditures of $1.4 trillion. If these numbers increase by 50% as proposed, we're looking at spending levels that dwarf most countries' entire GDP. Major defense contractors, companies like Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, Raytheon, and Boeing, will see enormous revenue increases from these budget allocations. Their stock prices have already begun reflecting these expectations. But for ordinary citizens, the benefits are far less clear. Defense spending doesn't build roads, improve schools, or expand healthcare access. It builds weapon systems, maintains military bases, and funds operations around the world. The question of how to finance this level of spending becomes critical. Some political figures have suggested that captured assets from terrorists or sanctioned entities could help cover costs, but financial analysts dismiss this as unrealistic. The numbers simply don't add up. The vast majority of this increased spending will need to be financed through borrowing, which means issuing more government debt. According to projections from budget experts, the initial $1.5 trillion budget request could balloon into a $5.8 trillion fiscal burden once interest payments are factored in over time. Even with additional tariff revenues and other income sources, the United States government will need to borrow hundreds of billions, potentially trillions, more than currently planned. This has profound implications for everyone, not just Americans. When the U.S. government borrows on this scale, it affects global interest rates. Capital that might have flowed into productive private sector investments gets diverted into government bonds. Interest rates stay elevated for longer, making mortgages more expensive, business loans more costly, and economic growth more difficult to achieve. The dollar's value could be affected as well. Historically, massive deficit spending has eventually led to currency depreciation as markets lose confidence in fiscal sustainability. This makes traditional safe haven assets, things like gold, real estate in stable markets, and other tangible stores of value, increasingly attractive to investors looking to preserve wealth. But America's military buildup doesn't happen in isolation. Other major powers are watching these developments carefully and adjusting their own strategies accordingly. China has already announced significant increases in its defense budget. Russia, despite its economic challenges, continues pouring resources into military modernization. European nations, feeling increasingly uncertain about American security guarantees, are discussing expanded defense cooperation and increased national spending. This creates the conditions for a global arms race, a competitive spiral where each country's military expansion justifies and encourages expansion by others. History has shown us where such dynamics can lead. Increased military spending tends to create institutional interests that push for continued expansion. Defense industries lobby for larger budgets. Military leaders argue for more advanced weapon systems. Political leaders use strength rhetoric to appeal to nationalist sentiments. The economic consequences of sustained global militarization include persistent inflationary pressures. When governments spend trillions on military equipment, they're competing with the private sector for labor, materials, and manufacturing capacity. This drives up costs across the economy. Additionally, military spending generally doesn't create the kind of productive economic returns that infrastructure or education spending can generate. For individuals trying to plan their financial futures, this environment of massive government spending, elevated interest rates, potential currency instability, and global military competition creates significant challenges. Traditional savings accounts lose purchasing power when inflation runs above interest rates. Stock markets become more volatile when geopolitical tensions rise. Even seemingly safe government bonds carry risks when national debt levels reach unprecedented heights. Throughout all of these interconnected crises, several questions remain frustratingly unresolved. Will Chinese authorities ultimately approve widespread NVIDIA chip imports, or will they continue blocking them as part of a broader technological independence strategy? Will the United Kingdom ever return Venezuela's gold to its new government? Or will those bullion bars sit in London vaults for another 5 years while lawyers argue about legitimacy and recognition? These aren't merely academic questions. Real companies with real employees are making billion-dollar investment decisions based on assumptions about how these situations will play out. Real people in Venezuela are affected by whether their country can access its own wealth. Real investors around the world are adjusting portfolios based on expectations about chip sales, frozen assets, and military budgets. The uncomfortable truth is that nobody has definitive answers. We're living through a period of genuine uncertainty where the old rules of international trade, finance, and diplomacy are being rewritten in real time. The post-war order that governed global affairs for 3/4 of a century is fragmenting, and what replaces it remains unclear. What we can say with confidence is that the intersection of technology, finance and military power has created a uniquely volatile mixture. A decision made in a Beijing conference room about semiconductor imports can immediately affect stock prices in New York. An announcement from the Pentagon about defense spending can shift interest rates globally. A legal ruling in London about Venezuelan gold can influence how sovereign wealth funds think about asset allocation. In this environment, staying informed becomes more than just intellectual curiosity. It becomes a practical necessity for making sound decisions. Understanding the connections between chip technology and economic growth, between frozen assets and financial security, between military budgets and inflation, provides the context needed to navigate an increasingly complex world. The path forward requires both awareness and preparation. Awareness of the forces reshaping global power structures, the technological competition between nations, the weaponization of finance, the return of great power military competition. Preparation in terms of financial resilience, diversified assets, and the flexibility to adapt as circumstances change. Because if 2026 has taught us anything so far, it's that the only certainty is continued uncertainty.